This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We have just been listening to the President-elect Joe Biden announce this task force he's put together. He calls it the COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board, which is going to advise him. Some really well-known doctors, particularly public health officials, who will be advising him and the vice president-elect on what to do once they take office to combat the coronavirus. And he laid out a comprehensive list of things to be done, everything from providing guidelines to figuring out how to distribute a vaccine if and when it becomes available, providing PPE, personal protective equipment. But in the end, he said, we all have to fight this virus together, and we can do it by wearing masks, as he said, without regard to whether we're Democrats or Republicans or who we voted for. We can beat this. He said the American people can meet every challenge. We can meet this one as well. So that is the president-elect, Joe Biden, with his first addressing of the issue he thought was number one, which is COVID-19. And we now are going to bring in Dr. Michael Kinch. He is director of the Centers for Research, Innovation in Biotechnology and Drug Discovery at Washington University of St. Louis. So thank you so much, doctor, for being with us. Appreciate it. You always point out you're not a medical doctor, but you get to be called doctor nonetheless. Give us a sense right now of what has triggered this in part today. We've had this announcement from Pfizer about some drug trials on a vaccine. They are promising about a 90% ability to fight off the virus. How excited should we be? Because the markets, goodness knows, are excited.
We should certainly be encouraged. It's great news, but keep in mind, it's still early. And I'm sure that's sort of going to burst a lot of people's balloons. But it's early in that we don't know how many people will end up being protected with this vaccine. The 90% number is obviously a very round number. It is based upon what appears to be a very good beginning data set. But there are still going to be questions. My very brief reading of the data was that there were a handful of people that were vaccinated that nonetheless came down with COVID. And I think the key questions there are going to be, are these in particular populations, perhaps based on age, based on race, gender, any number of different demographics. But again, this is far better news to have a 90% protection rate with a vaccine that appears to be safe than not to have that data.
Well, you just said the magic words, appears to be safe, because as I understand, there's some further testing perhaps that needs to be done to ensure safety. Already I'm hearing some people say, well, you've got to worry about autoimmune deficiency, various things it could be. What are we looking for on the safety aspect of this?
So on the safety aspect, we need to track it over time because it takes the immune system weeks or months to take off and really respond to the vaccine. And if by bad luck, it turns out that we end up targeting normal tissues in the body that might cause either an autoimmune type of response or an inflammatory type of response, then we need to know that. And we need to understand that for all of the different vaccine trials that are undergoing right now. I'm actually on a vaccine trial, and they are going to be monitoring me for 26 months.
Well, that's interesting. So you're a subject. That's interesting. Of course, you don't know whether you got the placebo or the real thing, right?
I have no idea.
Exactly. So come back to the 90% number. We're all fixated on that. And, we always love to jump on numbers, whether they're real or not. But give us a sense, if in fact it did prove to be 90% effective, how does that rank as opposed to other vaccines?
So it's on the positive side. A lot of childhood vaccines are in that 90% level. But more important than anything are two things to remember, one positive, one negative. The positive is that if we can establish what's been characterized or mischaracterized by many as herd immunity, which is that basically if we can get enough of the population to be protected through vaccination such that a virus has a hard time finding those few people who are still susceptible, that's the positive. And 90% appears to be above the number that has been projected to get herd immunity, which has been estimated to be in the 70% to 75% range. So the negative is there's still that 10% of the population that, especially in the short term, before herd immunity gets established, are going to be susceptible to this virus.
As you've been saying very wisely, and by the way, the President-elect Biden said that in a statement this morning as well. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is good news, it appears, but we can't go too fast. Let me nonetheless go forward a little bit. Let's assume for the moment the testing proves out that it does have this sort of level of effectiveness. How difficult is the distribution? What do you know about this particular vaccine? Because we've heard for some they have to be stored at very, very cold temperatures, for example.
Yeah, distribution on this and just the logistics are going to be a major challenge. For this vaccine and some of the others. What we've heard is that the temperatures required to maintain this are about a negative 100 Celsius, which means that most conventional freezers will not work. It's going to take deep freezers that have, unfortunately, they're prone to breakdown and other things. Plus, they're just extremely expensive. Another major issue is going to be vaccine wastage, and I'm sure you're going to hear that term in the future, which is that in a normal, for a standard vaccine, up to about a quarter of all the vaccine that's manufactured can't be used because that cold chain went off, which is a fancy way of saying that it's spoiled. And so that's going to be a big problem with a vaccine that requires negative 100 degrees Celsius storage.
So it feels like it's only yesterday we were talking about personal protective equipment and the fact that we don't have enough of it. Ventilators, we don't have enough of them in the United States. Do we have enough of those deep freezers? I mean, are we going to have a bottleneck here just in manufacturing enough capacity to distribute before you get to actually the logistics of it?
I would imagine that we are, and there are basically two problems. One is that there's going to be a big rush for these deep freezers, or for alternative. For example, liquid nitrogen might end up being utilized. There, at least we have capacity, but for industrial purposes. But again, we haven't distributed and used it in this way before. So there are going to be challenges in training and having the material. But the other problem, again, is that when you talk about, for example, returning to deep freezers, because they have to work so hard, the compressors on these things have to work so hard, they tend to fail very frequently. And a failed freezer means that the vaccine in it could be ruined. So we're going to run into these challenges. There will be occasional setbacks, but overall, we'll continue to move forward.
This was so terribly helpful. Thank you for spending your time, particularly today. It really informed us all, I think, quite a bit. That's Michael Kinch of Washington University out in St. Louis. Thank you, Doctor. Now we're going to turn to the remarkable markets movement today. We welcome now Paul Christopher, Head of Global Market Strategy at Wells Fargo Investment Institute. So thank you for being with us. We just heard from Dr. Kinch that we shouldn't get too excited about this, but it looks like the markets are off to the races, Paul.
Yeah, that's right. The markets have reacted any time in the last 6 months that we've had positive news on a vaccine, and this is perhaps the most positive news yet. But as you heard the doctor mention, there are some logistical issues here, not only keeping the virus very cold, but the distribution. We also don't know what the side effects may be, how many people might defer from taking the vaccine because they're afraid of side effects. We don't know that, how that contributes to herd immunity. These are still unknowns. But fortunately, we still have economic and market sentiment taking support from alternatives to a silver bullet vaccine, including things like cross-immunity from other vaccines and more rapid testing and tracing to reduce transmission. So you put that together with the news that began to emerge last week about a potentially divided government, and the markets have two things to really run with in a rally here.
Well, that's the question. What are they pricing in at this point? And are they overpricing, in fact, on both scores, both the election of President-elect Biden with apparently at least a divided Senate, as well as this vaccine? Are we getting too far ahead of ourselves? Are we hoping ourselves to success here?
Well, if you remember 2016 and the election then was also a surprise, and markets ran hard for several months before coming back down to earth and recognizing that political agendas take time to develop. There's opposition. Things don't get done quite as fast as one thinks they will. So the pricing that happens after an election can tend to be, let's say, a little bit too extrapolating. We still like certain trends that we believe will still be in place over the coming months, and we think investors, especially investors with cash, should be looking to put that cash to work incrementally, not ignoring what's going on here, but certainly not throwing all the chips in right now as prices rise. We think a gradual, incremental approach to putting cash to work. We like the U.S. Better than overseas. We like U.S. large and mid caps better than small caps. We like the tech-related sectors. There's still quite a COVID sort of stay-at-home trade going on with in tech, information technology, communications, services, consumer discretionary, so think companies that deliver products to your door that you order from online. And we like healthcare. And frankly, a lot of those trends could be helped by the political environment. For example, take a divided government. You might not see quite the rush to regulate tech and social media going forward. That's helped tech here. You might see more work on vaccines going forward. That's going to help healthcare. Healthcare is also going to be helped if divided government means that the two parties can't quite come to a way to change the managed care industry, and that uncertainty being eliminated or at least reduced would certainly help manage care. So we already have a lot of the favorites that we think the market will benefit in the market over the coming months, but we wouldn't rush to put cash to work here. Let's do it in a disciplined and incremental way.
Okay, so in a disciplined and incremental way, let's talk about a couple of other sectors, travel and leisure, because travel stocks really are shooting up today, including, as I understand it, cruise lines, things like that, and also banks. Do the banks stand potentially to benefit here?
Potentially. I mean, if the idea is that banks may not be as regulated going forward, or if economic growth improves enough that their yield curve could steepen, that long-term rates could rise and give banks a break in terms of lending rates, then that could help banks. But that one seems premature. Also, the travel and leisure seems a little bit premature to us. That's, again, an extrapolation based on what results we've seen in the last week from the election, but we're still a long way from being able to go back to normal. And that's not even a political question. That's a COVID question. It's a scientific, biological question that so far has resisted our best attempts at defeating it. We think COVID's going to be with us for some time further.
Paul, finally, let's spend a minute on bonds here. We haven't talked about bonds. We've been talking about equities as a practical matter. There was a time that, boy, the yield was just so low that it just didn't make any sense even to use it for a hedge. It's really shot up. We're up, what, 12, almost 13 basis points right now on the 10-year.
Sure. Again, rates like stocks might have a shorter-term reaction related to the vaccine news, perhaps, and certainly related to the political news, especially if the market thinks that growth will be the outcome 12 months from now, then rates could be higher. We are going to maintain a kind of an unbiased view, a neutral view on rates. We would hold the long and intermediate term rate bonds at close to long-term target allocation levels. We're just not persuaded yet that we've got a sustainable move higher in the slope of the yield curve.
Okay, Paul, that was terribly helpful. Thank you so much for being with us. It's Paul Christopher. He's head of global market strategy at Wells Fargo Investment Institute. Coming up, Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey gives us his views on a Biden presidency and what it means for the pandemic and for the economy as well. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. One of the states hit hard by the pandemic and by the economic downturn has been New Jersey. We talked with Democratic Governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, about how a Biden presidency could change things for his state.
We're at the bottom of a U. I wish it were the bottom of a V, but we're sort of bumping along. I inherited a state that had mismanaged its fiscal reality for literally decades, both sides of the aisle. So we've made an enormous amount of progress. I say with all due respect to S&P, I don't agree with their decision. The other rating agencies actually held us where we are. We've got people coming into New Jersey. We've got a big innovation economy, which is continuing to grow. As I mentioned earlier, our location is second to none. So getting our infrastructure rebuilt has a huge positive economic impact. But there's no question, this pandemic has thrown every state a haymaker, and we're going to be digging out of this for a while.
Do you anticipate further tax increases, or you think you are where you need to get to?
Yeah, I don't actually. I think we've done what we're going to do. I do think we need, without question, and we're not alone, we need a big federal stimulus, including at the state level.
That's an issue not just for the President of the United States, but he needs Congress to come along with him. That has been an issue, particularly with the Republicans in the Senate. Do you have reason for hope that they can get over that? Because as you know, the claim is you're really bailing out, is the term they use, some states that have been profligate, particularly in their pension plans.
Yeah, I mean, you won't be surprised. I take great exception to those statements because we actually were making an enormous amount of progress on those so-called legacy issues. We didn't need the federal government for that. We need the federal government to allow us to continue and to serve our people in this time of need, to keep frontline workers, firefighters, police, teachers, healthcare workers in their jobs. I am optimistic is the punchline. I think the Speaker and Mnuchin got close. I think President Trump, at least before the election, and I hope still so, wants to see that done. I think Leader McConnell is somebody who has said, while not in favor of the level of stimulus that we need, has at least said some things in a positive direction of late. So I actually have quiet optimism because it's going to benefit everybody, red, blue, and everyone in between.
Governor, you also mentioned infrastructure. We had quite a few infrastructure weeks, as I recall, under President Trump. At the same time, President-elect Biden says he wants to do it. Let me be very specific. What about that rail tunnel under the Hudson River? Is that going to get done now? Because as I understand it, there's money sitting there waiting for it, isn't there?
Yeah. The answer is unequivocally yes. And in fairness to President Trump, he has greenlighted the so-called Portal North Bridge, which is the first step on that project, and we're grateful for that. But the bigger, far bigger pieces are those tunnels under the Hudson and further work on both the New Jersey and New York side. I'm highly optimistic that will get greenlighted. I think President-elect Biden knows this project very well. He understands its significance for our economy, for job creation. So I'd say unequivocally that will happen.
Is it shovel ready? I mean, let's talk about a time horizon. When could you actually have people working on that project?
Yeah, literally, it is shovel ready, and you could envision putting a shovel in the ground first quarter next year.
It feels like the country's on the brink of a new regime, and we'll see where it takes us with President Biden. Are you concerned at all about setting expectations too high, that people will expect things to turn around right away? Does President Biden need to manage expectations a bit?
Yeah, I think he does. And I think the American people either get that or will get it. We've got big challenges. This is exactly the man to do it, exactly the administration for this moment in time. But it's not a light switch. Whether it's our domestic challenges, our foreign policy challenges, we're all in this together. It took us a while to get here. It's going to take us a while to get out of it, and whether that's the pandemic, economic recovery, you name it, but we will get there. We are America. We are far from perfect, but we are the greatest nation on earth, and this is exactly the right leader for this moment in time.
Part of my interview with New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's the first trading day for the president-elect, Joe Biden, and it is quite a day so far. Let's check in with our colleague, Scarlett Fu. Well, boy, those markets are on a run.
Yeah, it's a vote of confidence, I suppose, for the divided government that we're likely to get. J.P. Morgan says that the Biden victory with the Republican-controlled Senate is a Goldilocks outcome for U.S. equities. In fact, he calls it a market nirvana scenario. And we're seeing value stocks really get their moment, especially after the Pfizer vaccine announcement. Now, Pfizer's encouraging results made the Dow and small caps the clear outperformers. And I thought for a while that Pfizer was part of the Dow until I remembered that it got kicked out of the Dow. So far in November, the Dow's the best performing benchmark index as investors rotate from big tech to beaten Dow cyclicals. Now, Pfizer rose as much as 15%, its biggest gain ever. According to Barclays, it sees the vaccine generating more than $3 billion in revenue in 2021. But you go past the short term, medium and long-term sustainability is a question mark because we don't know how long the vaccine protection lasts, and there will be more competition, and it's not clear what pricing of the vaccine will look like as well. Pfizer, of course, did not accept government funding from the Operation Warp Speed project. BioNTech's ADRs are flying up 10%. Volume is actually off the charts. At midday today, 10 million shares changed hands. That's 4 times the full-day average over the last 3 months. And Moderna working on a vaccine candidate that uses a similar science, the messenger RNA molecule. It's up as well. AstraZeneca, which is working with the University of Oxford on its treatment, is down. The UK trial data is due in coming months. The US data not expected until the first half of next year. There's also some concern that volunteers in alternative studies may abandon projects once a vaccine is deemed effective. We'll see how that all plays out, David.
Thank you so much, Scarlett Fu, for that report on remarkable markets today. Up next, we begin to look at the next 4 years under a President Biden with economist and Nobel Laureate Paul Romer of NYU. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Karina Mitchell.
Thank you. President-elect Joe Biden is outlining his plans for helping the nation beat the coronavirus once he takes office in January. He warned today that the country is facing a, quote, dark winter and that bold action is needed. He called on all Americans to wear masks consistently as the best way to fight infection. Biden has formed a task force composed largely of doctors and public health experts to help map out policies needed to stop the pandemic. And another member of the Trump administration now has the coronavirus. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson tested positive for COVID-19 this morning. That's according to his deputy chief of staff. Carson attended an election night party at the White House Tuesday. President Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, tested positive for the virus the day after he attended that same event. And President Trump is vowing to go to court today to contest the election results. He is falsely claiming he won and that there was widespread fraud in the voting process. The president hasn't offered up any hard evidence so far. And congratulations have flooded in from across the world for President-elect Joe Biden, but one world leader who has stayed silent is Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin says Putin won't comment on the election until all legal challenges have been resolved. President Trump has refused to concede his loss and has alleged large-scale voter fraud. Other holdouts in offering their congratulations include the leaders of China, Brazil, Turkey, and Mexico. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Karina. President-elect Joe Biden will come to office with a series of policy goals, but may well face a divided Congress. And so we begin a look at the next 4 years of a Biden administration and what it might hold. We begin today with the larger economic questions and welcome Paul Romer. He's NYU professor of economics and Nobel Laureate. So, Paul, it's always such a delight to have you with us. Let's start with what is one might think is not an economic question, but it is, and that's COVID-19. Because most economists say we can't get there without getting past COVID-19.
That's right. And also, I think we need to adopt the mindset that we've got to find a better way to escape from this pandemic, to bring it under control. I'm afraid that this might turn into an exercise where people say, well, the blue states had it right, the red states had it wrong, they've got to behave more like the blue states. Neither of them did that well. The blue states had a lower death rate, but they've also had slower recoveries of employment back to where we were in January. So we need a new measure that's different from what either side was doing in the last 3 or 4 months. And I think it's clear what that measure is. Do what the NBA did. Do what Harvard and Cornell and NYU were doing. Test people frequently, isolate them, and then let's get back to business.
By the way, do what Taiwan did, as I understand it. Do what South Korea did as well. In fact, we just heard from the president-elect a short time ago where he came in and said, boy, this news about a possible vaccine is really good news, but we're not there yet. And it's going to take us some time. So it's pretty basic. We got to test. We got to do contact tracing, wear a mask, whatever you do. And he said specifically, it doesn't matter who you voted for. Now, that seems pretty simple, but the simple can sometimes be hard because it's not clear people are going to comply with that.
Yeah, well, there was an interesting comparison of how New Jersey responded to an outbreak in the Orthodox Jewish community as opposed to how New York responded. New York responded with the more traditional public health measures, mandates, don't group together in big groups, don't do this, don't do that, wear masks. In New Jersey, they just started testing people and gave people the information. And this produced less of a backlash in New Jersey and more compliance, because once people started to see how many of them were infected, they took this much more seriously.
So as you say, we've got to figure out a way to do both, walk and chew gum, as it were, which is to say, keep the economy as open as we can, at the same time protect people. But beyond that, there are larger issues over the next 4 years, 8 years, 12 years that we need to address with the economy. And we have some people saying, look, in order to really get growth going again, because as you know well, Professor Romer, we've not had really growth rates with the developed countries for some time the way we did before. We need some massive thing, something like a Marshall Plan, effectively, to really invest in the economy. By the way, we could use the infrastructure, and we need to move to green technology at the same time.
No, you're absolutely right. If you look at the growth over this entire recovery up until the pandemic, both like the second Obama term and the Trump term, this had the lowest rate of GDP growth of any recovery since the end of World War II. So there is something deeper, structural, that we have to address. And, this is a time when borrowing is inexpensive. This is the time to go big on borrow and build. So I hope we can reach a consensus on the kinds of things we could borrow and then build to make the country better.
And Professor Romer, as I say, you received the Nobel Prize for your work in economics. And in part, I understand that was a growth theory that had to do with information and particularly government investing. We have Arvind Krishna, who's the CEO of IBM, just provided me with a letter that he's written to President Trump, President-elect Biden, saying, look, we need to leverage science technology. We need to close the skills gap. We need to modernize digital infrastructure. It sounds like the sorts of things you talk about.
Yeah, although, the joke about economists, there's always this other hand. I worry just a little bit that this is going to sound like the scientists saying, we told you so. Like, we told you so, we were right, give us more money, give us more power, and everything will be fine. I think the scientific community, the academic community, has to take ownership of the fact that expertise is not respected in the same way it once was. So we need to figure out what it will take to rebuild the confidence and trust amongst most members of the public. And we're not going to get there by just brute force or scolding people.
Well, when you talk about expertise, it makes me think a bit about the government itself, the federal government itself, because various experts have written saying that under the Trump administration, there has been a de-emphasis, if I can put it that way, on expertise, and that perhaps we don't have the same intellectual firepower, the intellectual capital that we had before within the government.
Yep. Yeah, we not only haven't promoted people, we've left positions unfilled, but we've also frozen people. We've paralyzed them so that they're afraid to make decisions. I think of this poor woman whose job it is at the GAO to decide whether there's a consensus that the election is over and then triggers the transition process. This woman is like frozen in place, afraid to make a decision because she's afraid she'll get yelled at if she does what's the obvious thing, is to recognize that the election is over. And there were people in the FDA, people in the CDC in the same way. They were frozen. They wouldn't take leadership. They wouldn't act. They wouldn't take the kind of bold steps we needed to take. So we need an administration that gives people the confidence to rely on their professional expertise and do their jobs.
Do we know whether that's something the president can do with his administration without the support of the Congress? Because it looks like right now it's more likely than not that the Senate will have a majority of Republicans.
Yeah, I think that the person who's at the very top of the executive branch exerts an enormous influence over all of the decisions made by all of the people under the executive branch. And I think the signal from the top that you will be trusted, you will be respected, even if you disagree with some of your peers or some other policy statement from within this administration. That respect, I think, can enable the people all up and down the bureaucracy to do their jobs.
I want to come back to this question of growth because you've spent so much time studying it, understanding it. There are certain factors that I'm not sure we have a lot of control over, such as demographics. We don't have a growing population the way we did before, which, as I understand it, in history has helped generate some of what the growth that we've had. If we don't have that demographic support, what can we have instead of that?
Yeah. Well, remember, the size of the population is something we could control. There are millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who would like to move into the United States and who would be wonderful people to join us as citizens if we could get ourselves together and figure out a way to welcome them back in the way we did in the past. But if we can't reach that consensus, and we probably can't for a while, there are other things we can do, like better investments in educational opportunity. Something bold like what we did with creating the land-grant universities under the Morrill Act during the Civil War in 1862. It was another time of polarization, but yet an administration decided to make this bold initiative, this bold bet on science and education, and it paid off for a century after that.
But I wonder if the politics permit that today, because I wonder, Professor Romer, whether you can get the payback in productivity from education within the life cycle of a president, for example, of 4 or 8 years. Is that a longer term, almost generational move?
I'm afraid the things that could really change the quality of life for my grandkids when they're working adults aren't going to pay off in a big way in the life cycle of an administration. So it will take some time, I think, to rebuild a consensus in this country that there's some things we do because it's the right thing to do and because we believe in the future of this country and we care about our future citizens. But I think we can get back to that place. Things are bad right now, but they're not as bad as they were during the Civil War.
That's a fair statement. It's important to remember that. Thank you so much to Paul Romer. He's NYU professor of economics and Nobel laureate. Coming up, we continue our look at the next 4 years, this time with international trade, with Rufus Yerxa, former Deputy Director General of the WTO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. President Trump undertook a major reshaping of U.S. trade policy with China, with Canada and Mexico, and with Europe. And European Commissioner for Trade Valdis Dombrovskis gave us a reminder just today that there's a fair amount of trade tension to be addressed still when it comes to Europe.
A decision related to tariffs in Boeing case is not linked with U.S. elections. It's linked with the fact that WTO has given us the award for $4 billion and linked with our internal procedures.
Okay, we welcome now Rufus Yerxa, president of the National Foreign Trade Council. Mr. Yerxa served as Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization and as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Rufus, great to have you back here. What Mr. Dombrovskis is talking about, of course, is this tit for tat going back on aviation between the United States and Europe. They've now announced, I think, $4 billion in tariffs. But they were very careful to say, look, if the new president comes in and plays nice, we're willing to take him back down. Is this a new era for U.S. trade relations?
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing, David, is obviously the last shots in the Trump trade war with Europe. You know, he's obviously escalated tensions quite a bit through the 232 tariffs. The Boeing Airbus dispute, of course, is a little bit different because both sides took it to the WTO. Both sides had findings against each other, and both sides actually had authorized retaliation. But unfortunately, the bad atmosphere between the two of them made it impossible for them to get a deal. I think when Biden comes in, you know, he will put an emphasis. He's already said he wants to draw closer to our trading partners. He wants to get these tariff fights behind us and move towards a more unified approach with Europe on critical issues like China.
So one of the questions we have, because it appears right now that the more likely result, not certain, but more likely result, is that the United States Senate will have a majority of Republicans. How much can the president, and I guess his trade representative, do on their own without the support of Congress?
Well, there's a lot of things he can do early on. You know, first of all, David, you realize, and I know you know this, that his top priorities are domestic. It's getting a plan for the pandemic in place, which has a global aspect, but it's dealing with the domestic economic crisis and relief package and those kinds of things. But I think on the trade front, his main steps early on will be to try to, both in terms of tone and in substance, move in a different direction. Less emphasis on the use of tariffs, more emphasis on drawing closer to trading partners. I do think he's going to do a lot in the Buy American subsidies area, which he signaled in his campaign. But I think the go-it-alone approach against China is going to change. And I think he's going to draw closer to the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, and I think set a different tone in the WTO, where there's both a leadership challenge and an issue of deadlock over the future direction of the organization and its dispute system.
So can he decide we're going to be multilateral with respect to China, that you just mentioned, as rather than unilateral, and not be perceived as having gone soft on China? Because no matter what the rhetoric is, would it take some time to get a multilateral approach to China together?
Yeah, I think he can do it. It's obviously a difficult sort of shift in direction, but clearly Biden has pointed out, and I think with a great deal of evidence behind this, that the Trump approach to China hasn't really worked. The trade deficit with China is just about where it was. We haven't really gotten fundamental reform in many of China's practices and policies. Xi Jinping continues to move in the wrong direction. And meanwhile, the tariffs in the U.S. have hurt a lot of U.S. Producers and exporters. U.S. agriculture, for example, we're still not back to where our agricultural exports were before the trade war began. And here's an interesting statistic, David. You know, these quantitative deals that Trump made, which was supposedly going to double our exports to China, actually 40% of US exports weren't covered by those quantitative commitments. And that 40% has declined by 30% since the deal was made. So, the Chinese have not really delivered, and it was probably because the weapons that Trump used really weren't crafted in the right way. Now, I think what Biden will do is develop a comprehensive sort of all of government strategy of how you deal with China, the trade problem, the technology and cyber theft issues, the security issues, as well as issues about how they handle subsidies and state-owned enterprises, overcapacity, all of those things. And I think it'll be a while before that strategy is unveiled, but I think for sure it will involve more collaboration with the rest of the world in kind of figuring out how to push Xi Jinping in a different direction.
Rufus, we hear about perhaps a large number of executive orders that might be ready to go on day one of a Biden administration. Does he have within his power to pull back all those tariffs, the 232s and the 301s, all that we've talked about so much? Can he pull that back at once? And maybe as important, would it make sense for him to pull back on that before he has a comprehensive approach to things like countervailing duties and state subsidies and capacity issues that you mentioned?
Well, first of all, he does have that power, but I would think that they will take a deliberative approach to this and look at them case by case and country by country. I don't think there's any doubt that he's already signaled he wants to de-escalate the tariff wars with Europe, with our Japan, with our best allies, and so I think a review of 232, but that doesn't mean he'd necessarily leave the steel industry high and dry. I think they'll look at what they can do in both the subsidy field and in normal WTO legal kinds of import measures, like countervailing duties, like Section 201. There's a lot you can do. So I think they'll kind of be deliberative about how they move. And on the China front, I think also, I think he will want to chart a different path, but it doesn't necessarily mean all those tariffs are going to come down right away. I think it'll take time for that to take shape. None of us really know. He hasn't even chosen his team yet. They have been focusing on a lot of other bigger priorities. I think in time, a Biden trade policy will be more centrist. He'll reach for bipartisanship, and he'll be much more involved in multilateralism and global institutions and pushing for U.S. leadership. I think he's going to push for a reform agenda in the WTO for sure.
Okay, let's stay on the WTO a minute, because President Trump was no fan of the WTO, I think it's fair to say. Can the president keep us in the WTO on his own? And particularly importantly right now, as I understand it, they're looking for a leader.
Yeah, exactly. There is this issue of a director general, and I think that, the Trump administration has blocked that process sort of unilaterally. The interesting thing when I talk to my colleagues in governments around the world is, we would like to engineer a situation where China is more isolated in the WTO. And actually, the Trump policies of the last 4 years have done the exact opposite. The U.S. is more isolated in the WTO than China is right now. And I think Biden can change that very quickly by showing the U.S. is not going to pull out of the WTO. We're not going to continue taking a whole lot of clearly WTO illegal actions. We're going to push for the rules to be updated. They need to be changed. There need to be better and stronger disciplines on China. And I think slowly but surely, he will turn this wheel to create much greater leverage and use the WTO as a tool to promote market-oriented, rules-based trade and force the Chinese to realize that they can't turn their back on economic reforms, take advantage of weaknesses in the system, and be seen as a leader.
Great. Thank you so much. Always a treat to have you with us. That's Rufus Yerxa. He's National Foreign Trade Council president. Coming up, stocks reach record highs on vaccine optimism. We'll look at which sectors are driving the rally. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. There's a lot going on today, but boy, I think the markets have to just about take the top billing. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So they continue to be, I guess, we're at record levels with the Dow and the S&P, right?
It's really an extraordinary day here, David. We have risk on, risk on, risk on. Stocks are simply surging, bonds are plunging. And of course, a piece of this is President-elect Joe Biden. But the bigger piece, as you know, has to do with that vaccine news out of Pfizer, the 90% efficacy, so hopes that a reopening will happen sooner rather than later. The Russell 2000, that small cap index, absolutely surging. Its best day, in fact, I should say its first record high since 2018. So those bulls finally pushing through. It extends to the commodity complex. Oil is sharply higher, the best day since March, again on hopes around the economy really reopening much sooner than had been expected. Bonds, the worst day since March. So that is risk on. That's the risk on story. However, as President-elect Joe Biden said during his press conference not so long ago, talking about the coronavirus task force, there are some difficult weeks and months ahead potentially until this vaccine really gets out there. So there's this awkward time period. We're seeing that in divergences, David, between the sectors, because the best sector on the day, energy, up with oil, up about 15%, its best day since March. The banks, the regional banks, really soaring, up about 14%, the best day also since March. On the other hand, you have that New York FANG complex, this year's big safety trade, the high flyers, that index is actually lower, in part on Amazon and Facebook, both of those stay-at-home names lower. And we also have, interestingly, the biotech index down. So interesting divergences, some more volatility. There could be some more of the same ahead. But right now, the bulls are really charging, David.
Well, there's been a lot of volatility, but you have to ask yourself, given those moves, Abigail, is it possible that we're getting ahead of ourselves?
Great question, David. And you and I have been talking about a range for the S&P 500. And the market, I am sad to say, and you called this really quite well in terms of intuition, the market had been saying that we have this range. It was unclear which way it would break. It has broken to the upside. But sometimes you have what's called a false initial reaction. Investors get too far ahead of themselves, too far ahead of their skis. They buy now, have to look and think about it later. If a false initial reaction happens, that could suggest the S&P 500 would go right back down into the range. But right now, David, the index, the S&P 500, is actually confirmed for about 3,900. So we'll have to see whether or not investors start to rethink that. But today, again, the bulls are charging.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the volatility remains. It's going to be fascinating to watch this as it unplays for the next month or so, actually, frankly. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle reporting on the markets. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with John Authors of Bloomberg Opinion. His latest piece says that the Biden rally just might have the look of fool's gold to it. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.